Hello, my name is Lucy Carone Elliott, and we're so glad you could join us for today's webinar on promoting mental health in the workplace. This month is especially important as we recognize Mental Health Awareness Month, and what better way to honor it than by exploring practical strategies to foster support, inclusivity, and self advocacy in a work environment. We'll dive into top approaches that both organizations and individuals can use to prioritize mental health, reduce stigma, and create a culture where everyone feels valued. We are honored to have distinguished presenters with us today who will guide us through an insightful discussion on integrating mental health into everyday workplace practices. They'll share expert insights and actionable steps to help leaders, managers, and team members support both themselves and one another more effectively. Throughout the session, we'll explore key areas such as recognizing signs of mental health challenges, promoting work life balance, and building systems of support that enhance both individual and organizational resilience. We're excited for this opportunity to learn, reflect, and engage with you today. Our goal is for you to leave this session with a deeper understanding of how to promote mental well being in your workplace and with the tools to help create lasting positive change. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today: Nayali Hernandez, Dr. Sandra Villacorta, and Dr. Esmeralda Zamudio. Nayali Hernandez Pimentel, a Latina leader, advocate, and mentor dedicated to advancing mental health conversations and professional growth. As president of Prospanica Indianapolis, she supports the career development of underrepresented professionals while promoting workplace well being. With over a decade of experience in workforce strategy, Nayeli champions mental health awareness and workplace policies that foster employee success. Her personal journey and leadership inspire Latinas to overcome stigma, embrace self care, and thrive both personally and professionally. Next, we have Dr. Sandra Villacorta, apologies, a clinical psychologist currently completing an assessment focused doctoral internship in Las Vegas, Nevada. This fall, they will begin a postdoctoral position in California, working primarily with children and adolescents in private practice. With experience across community mental health, university, clinic, and private practice settings, Dr. Sandra is dedicated to culturally responsive care. A proud Salvadorian and openly queer, they advocate for reducing mental health stigma in the Latina community and increasing representation of Latina psychologists. Their work challenges traditional gender norms and promotes inclusivity in mental health spaces. And finally, Dr. Esmeralda Zamudio, a core faculty in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles, California. She is also the coordinator of the Latinx Mental Health Emphasis and assistant director of clinical training. She received her doctorate degree from Alliant International University in San Francisco, where she was part of the social justice track, and specializes in the mental health of undocumented Latinx immigrants. She received her certificate in Latin American families from Alliant International University in Mexico City. More importantly, Dr. Zamudio is the proud daughter of immigrant parents from Mexico, is a first-generation college student, and has studied under maestros from Osaka and traditional Chinese medicine. What an amazing group of panelists. So excited for this. So what we'll do is we'll kick off with some questions that we have arranged already, and during this time, we'll also encourage anybody listening to put your questions in the chat, and we'll have an opportunity to respond to some of those individualized questions as well. So to get started, the first question, and I'll direct this to you, Dr. Zamudio. In what ways does our cultural upbringing shape how we perceive mental health?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Lucy. I think it's an important question that I think all of us reflect upon when we're thinking about mental health and how culture really set the tone for how we talk about it. In so what I think culture does is set the norms for sort of like how we disclose or dictates how, when, and where, and how we share things related to mental health, how we feel, how we behave, how we think. And so I feel that, culture has a major influence on mental health. And in particular, in the Latinx community, I think culture has really sort of perpetuated sort of some ideas around mental health. Oftentimes we think, it's mental health is not something that we talk about. There's really a stigmatization and embarrassment, a shame that comes with talking about it. And I'll hear, from other voices in the group, but I do feel that this sentiment was brought on after the conquista, after the colonization of sort of Mexico, what is present day Mexico, Central America, and other Latin American countries, in that mental health was more normalized back in our ancestral days. And so I think, culture has a big role, and I think we have an opportunity to change some of that.
I just want to piggyback off of what Dr. Zamudio said and kind of focus on what I researched in my doctoral program, which I focused on machismo and marianismo, and how those gender roles also impact how we choose our careers, what we go into, how we show up in the workplace. And so in terms of mental health and work, I think it's there we get a lot of messages on how we should act. And I'm a recovering workaholic myself, and I always thought like my value was very much centered around how much I produce, how much I can provide, how much I can care for other people. And still have some of that, obviously becoming a psychologist, a therapist, but I think it's really important to also find the balance in that, in wanting to obviously keep some of those cultural values that we've been brought up with, but not to a point to our detriment, of course.
And Nayali, would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think what I have seen is that it's also harder for men to seek mental health assistance than for women, right? Because there are some stereotypes that have been imposed on men and women, and like men have to be strong, they cannot cry, right? Like boys don't cry. That is like a famous phrase, and that creates a lot of resistance for like to seek help when they are struggling, right? Because it's like, no, like I it's not okay for me to be vulnerable. And I think, like Sandra mentioned, in our Hispanic culture, it's even worse because you have those machismo stereotypes that are like even a little bit more augmented, I would say, that in the American culture, right? Like where you have to be like tough, you have to be strong. So yeah, I think that really plays a big role in why some men don't search for help.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. It's about a year ago we actually did one of these webinars on machismo and marianismo. So it's a topic we could really obviously delve into. Still so much to talk about that. But I guess another question is, recognizing some of these challenges, how can we begin to unlearn some of these harmful narratives while still honoring our roots? Um, I don't know who'd like to start with that one.
I can start off with that. It definitely is a lot of self-exploration, self-reflection. I think a lot of the times we tend to stray away from that, whether it's because we're in survival mode and trying to just get through day by day. Other times it's because we do have a fear of being labeled, right? There's the stigma of like, oh, well, therapy is para los locos. It's only for crazy people. And so if I, walk into a therapist's office, I'm willingly labeling myself as bad, as off. And we really just have to humanize our experiences that, yes, we are strong and resilient and joyful as a culture, but we're also, filled with lots of trauma and lots of historical, generational impacts. And so we really have to start to unpack it and just, talk about it. Something I also learned within my research was this whole culture of silence, and how Nayeli was talking about, like, it really impacts both male and female and gender diverse people, because women are told to be quiet and being a good girl and all these things in a different way. And then men are also told to be quiet and be strong and be resilient and be the rock, right? And so there's this feeling of like, oh, well, let's not talk about it. Let's brush it under the rug. And so it's really about also redefining things like vulnerability, like, emotion, like sadness is something powerful, as something transformative, instead of something that's scary or bad.
I see you nodding, Esmeralda. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I was like, okay, are people ready for this throwback reference? Because I was just thinking of Gloria Trevi. Are y'all familiar with Gloria Trevi? Quiero tener pelo suelto. Like, I'm like, oh yeah. She has a song that talks about El Doctor Psiquiatra. In that song, she talks about how harmful it was to see a psychiatrist. And I was just thinking, like, what historically have those interactions been like for our cultura or our gente, like our Latinx community, to go see very westernized psycho therapy, like people who didn't understand our culture and who really just wanted to medicalize, like have us be numb, to our feel and fit a certain stereotype or fit a certain norm. And I'm just thinking, there is a history to, I think, mental health here that also we're also trying to sort of demystify and do better. I do think that, when I was going to graduate school, I know my parents would say, like, why are you going? What are you going to do? I'm like, well, I want to help people. And they're like, well, don't people go just to vent and just say everything that's on their mind? Like, well, yeah, but they're also working through it. Están trabajando. Like, this is something that they want to work on. So there is a goal. There is sort of an like something that they want to get better at for themselves. Like Doctora Villacorte was saying, that people are wanting to self-reflect on areas in their life that they want to improve upon, right? And another friend was like, well, I know somebody that's been going to therapy for years. Están igual. They're the same. And it's, everybody has their own journey. And when you go into mental health, like to see a therapist, it's like going to the gym. Sort of, you want to focus on your arms or your legs, but it really is sort of a self-imposed sort of goal. Like, what specifically do you want to work on? There's some shorter term goals, there's some longer term goals. And so, yeah, so that's just to say, like, it can seem abstract and complicated what happens in mental health, but I think that when we honor ourselves in that process, and we honor sort of the lineage maybe of possible intergenerational trauma that we inherit, I do think we're honoring our roots in that way. And I also want to say, like, there are influencers and on Instagram and TikTok who are like demystifying this process with humor. Right? I saw a recent one where there's a mom that was dealing with depression, and the dad saying, like, oh, you just don't think about it, and it'll go away. And then the mom was like, okay. And then the dad's like, okay, well, I'm gonna go to the gym and work on the stomach. And then the mom was like, well, just don't think about it and it'll go away. It's just like, yeah. So it's just like, I think humor is a good way of sort of
Yeah.
interrupting.
I mean, it's interesting because as you're talking, you talk about there's the cultural, but even within the cultural, I feel like there's the generational, right? Like, I know when we were talking, in the introductions, we've got some sort of first gen students and different things like that. And how does that element layer in as well to the cultural experience?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about that locally, like the younger generations are a little bit more open about mental health, right? Like in having a therapist and talking about it. And when you mentioned how can we demystify this with like and keeping our roots. So talking about it, having like spaces like this one where we can talk about this and say like, just because you are going to see a therapist doesn't mean that you're crazy, right? One of the things that I think is like, um, no one is born knowing how to drive a car, right? We all go and like take classes either from our family or go with like an instructor or something like that, because like life doesn't come with instructions, and there are times where like we need help, right? And it's okay to like look for help and seek for help. And also, we have like more like movies like Intensamente or Inside Out. Me being like a psychology major, I love those movies. I was like, yes, we need more like this, right? Like where we can talk about that. And then also you have the movie Encanto, where they are like, we don't talk about Bruno. And it's like, yeah, we don't talk about those like, traumas, the generational traumas. And but having this kind of like movies, like could be good for families to start having these conversations, right? Say like, okay, yeah, like this is something that has been in the family, but it doesn't mean that it has to continue. It doesn't mean that I have to pass down like that generational trauma. So talking about that is how we can get better at it. And also you mentioned humor. And I think humor is actually something that is part of our culture as Hispanics, right? I was talking with my husband earlier today about how we see like death, like and then we even like joke about it, and we have those calaveras where we write like a whole like rhyme about like, oh yeah, like this person is gonna die and the reaper is gonna come and get them, and it's like a whole like joke. And then we have competitions about that, because like it's part of our culture to just see things with humor, and humor is a healthy coping mechanism, right? But also like at which point then you seek help, right? Like we don't make fun of the people that are actually looking for help. And there's one other point that I also want to mention is like when you go see a therapist and you don't have a good experience, which it happens, and then people
Yeah.
don't seek additional help because they didn't have a good experience. But something that was like super helpful that one of my professors told me when I was in college, she said, therapists are like shoes. If they don't fit you, then you just switch it. And then you have to be comfortable with your therapist. You have to be, um, you know, be able to be yourself and comfortable to talk about what you want to work on. And if it doesn't feel right, then just look for another one. But unfortunately, there are times where like there's just not a good match. And then they think that that's how psychotherapy should be.
Yeah.
And we also need to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, I think, for those of us that like the shoes. We understand, you know. So I'm going to pivot a little bit from to now the workplace, and just to kind of talk a little bit about how can workplaces help to move beyond surface level wellness initiatives to truly integrate mental health into leadership, team dynamics, and the organizational culture? I know there's a lot to unpack in that question, but I think it's another great place to discuss. I don't know, Sandra, did you want to kick that one off?
Sure. Right now I'm thinking of individually, right? I'm still very much like somewhat in the student role, and so I'm thinking about power dynamics and sometimes how hard it is for us as employees to advocate for ourselves. And then again, being first gen, being growing up, being like a workaholic again, like my work is my value, and so like me placing a boundary with my supervisor and saying like this is beyond my means, back like maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would have been like, I'm not doing that. Like what the heck, like I'm gonna get in trouble, I'm gonna get fired, something's gonna happen to me. So this is like fear of like possibly losing your job security because you're realizing, hey, I'm human too, and this workload is getting beyond me, right? And so it's really knowing your own limits, and they're going to change, they're going to fluctuate, right? Because maybe one year you're having a great year and everything's going good, and maybe the next year you're going through a lot of grief and a lot of loss. And so really understanding that your work like ethic, your work productivity is going to look different every day. um I think honestly, more like macro level, I think organizations really need to stop focusing on the numbers, on the money of what, especially in mental health, on what people are bringing in, and more so focus on how we can really provide holistic care so that there isn't this like open door where people are constantly coming back to therapy or having, like Nayeli said, like these really horrible experiences where they don't even want to try anymore. And so I think I would also like to add that when it comes to seeking jobs, I think it's also really important to ask very hard-hitting questions, I would say, that kind of gauge that this organization, wherever I'm going to be working with, whoever I'm going to be collaborating with, actually do match to my own personal or cultural values. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned throughout my training experiences and how to ask the right questions in interview, so that thankfully, the places that I have been employed at have been very mental health focused. And like right now, I'm this assessment focused site, and we're all very neurodivergent here. And so, like, there's STEM toys everywhere. Like, if one of my colleagues gets up and starts hand flapping, like, we know, like, just give them a little time. And so, I think that's also how the integration of mental health looks like in the workplace as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. We recently had like a conference, and at every table, they had a box, and it was just full of all fidgets and gadgets, and it's great, and yeah. So it's interesting, right? When you think about what are the little things that organizations can do, right, to help the culture. What are some other thoughts that you have on sort of within the workplace? I don't know, Esmeralda or Nayali?
Yeah, this is actually one of the questions that I was like the most excited when I saw, the questions for this conversation, because I think it needs to come from the top, honestly. Like when leaders are vulnerable and they say, hey, um, with like radical candor and vulnerability, some of the conversations that Brene Brown has had about this topic, it's also important to know when to share, when to be vulnerable. But I think having those conversations are like, hey, yeah, I'm going through this, like it humanizes, the leaders, and it gives the team that like psychological safety to also be vulnerable, and kind of like what Sandra was saying, like, hey, like this workload is over my head, right? Like I need some help, because I, for example, work in a at some point in a Fortune 500 company where it was like very hard to get in, and everyone was like a high achiever and like a top performer. And I was like, I cannot say anything because like everyone is just, also doing the same thing. But then I realized that that is just not healthy, right? So having that kind of like permission, if you will, from the top down to say like it's okay to say when you are not doing okay, and so it needs to come from the top. And also again, having spaces like this within the company where you can talk about this, right, and say like it's okay, and having those resources. A lot of the companies have employee assistance programs that people don't know about, but you get like 12 sessions a year, where like most of the times those are free, and that can help you to get through a hard time, because sometimes we have situations at home that it makes harder for us to be productive at work, and then just having those resources are helpful, but a lot of people don't even know, so talk about that and then normalize it, that it is okay to not be okay sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. Like I remember growing up in an environment, or at least a work environment, where mental toughness was prioritized, and you couldn't be weak-minded and such, and so on and so forth. I think because, just like Nayeli was saying, like because of conversations like this, like we're like normalizing that life does happen. Life is complex and people are complex, and we have things that happen outside of work that impact our productivity, impact our engagement, that impact who, like, ourselves. And so I think having like committees or task forces that like focus on mental health and how that could be integrated into different aspects of work, just like those fidget spinners that you all are sharing, or like the toys, having, I don't know, this is a fantasy of mine, just having like nap pods somewhere, right? But that's nice. But I I think that we have to, like, especially during, like, after COVID, I think we have to think about what is sustainable. People did not want to come back to the office after sheltering in place. Why? Because they appreciated not being in traffic for hours and hours. They appreciated having more of a work-life balance. They appreciated being around their families a little bit longer, right? Or their dogs even, right? And so I think that I just, yeah, normalizing that, it does come from the top. I 100% agree with you. Like that has to be modeled by example. And I think it's a radical shift that I think this new generation of folks are really on board with.
Just to dig into that a little bit, sort of, you mentioned, I think all of you essentially mentioned a lot of it is that from the culture, kind of the top down. So for someone who's a people manager or a team leader, what are some of the things that they can do, right? Because there are also so many aspects to mental health, right? I mean, there's folks that need more regular conversation, somebody who might be going through a bereavement or a life change or different things. What are some of the things as leaders that we could do while also making sure HR stays happy and that you're not crossing any boundaries? Because I know that that's also one of the challenges a leader sometimes. Sorry, and that wasn't really quite on the list, but it was a little deep dive.
I'll just share my 2 cents. It's just a little, for me, and what I do. Like I'm a professor, right? So when I teach, I'm in front of the classroom and I can tell when students are not there, like mentally, right? And so what I like to do, and Sandra, you can test this, like I do check-ins in the beginning of class, like and this could be done in the beginning of a meeting as well, just like a short, like 2-minute, like check-in, if you want to put a time to it, and people can share what they feel comfortable with sharing.
That's great. It's a great idea.
Right. And that gives you, because people share, I just had a car accident, or my parent is ill, or I have to, do this other thing. And that's what's on my mind. But but I'm really here, but that's what's on my mind, and that's what looks like
Yeah.
I might not be engaged with. But yeah, that's an
Yeah,
example.
that's a great tactic. That's a great thing. It's a great takeaway.
Something that comes up for me is again just like actionable steps that leaders can do. And so like again, sometimes they're going into therapy can be very intimidating, you know, getting your first foot through that door. And so events like this where it does promote mental health in the workplace, maybe like a meditation session. We've done things in my previous practicums where we've like had a dessert hour and like everyone brings in a sweet treat and you know we all sit around and just you know and so I think that really focuses on the team building, the bonding, and I think with that that comes the trust, the rapport, you know, because again it is hard sometimes to talk to a higher up about your mental health issues, about what's going on at home, again keeping it professional, but again there's this like worry in the back of certain people's heads of like, is this going to impact my ability to
Right.
stay here? Are they going to be treating me differently because they see me in this light? And so, I think maybe another one more thing I would add is just getting increased training around mental health, around what that looks like. What does anxiety look like in the workplace? What does depression look like in the
That's
workplace?
a great one. Yeah.
That leaders are also like understanding like, okay, maybe Johnny's being lazy and like, you know, suboptimal effort, like they're really struggling, you know? And seeing that, humanizing a person first, then seeing them as an employee second.
Yeah, I really love that. That's a great, those are really some actions I think that folks can take within the workplace, right? To understand, you know, there's always opportunities for leaders to improve and those are some great ways. And that builds a little bit of that organizational culture, right? In so many aspects. So another question is, what does mental strength look like in a world that often celebrates, and we talked a little bit about this, overwork and emotional suppression, and how do we redefine resilience on our own terms? Nayali, did you want to start?
Yeah, I would love to. And so, like I mentioned, um, being vulnerable. And I think this is something that I have seen in some of the great leaders across different companies. Just, you know, saying like, it's okay to not be okay. I know, like, I said this again and again, but just it shows that kind of like when you don't know everything, and you said like, I don't know, like it's also okay to say like, yeah, I'm not okay with this, or just being able to say this, hit home. Like, this impacted me, this like, move my emotions. That it's okay to have those conversations and show that we don't need to be stoic leaders. We are humans and we have feelings. And I think it is changing. I'm seeing that more and more where like people, say like, yeah, like it's not like this stoic like leader anymore. Like, because one thing that I wanted to also discuss today is kind of like the purpose of work, and so Eric Erickson talk about like the social development. And if you think about when we are in school, we had that group where we can connect with our classmates, right? But then once we're out of school, then work is the one that takes that place of that human connection and that human interaction. So being able to have that trust and build that trust with your team and with your leader, like, is really important. And then one thing that I read recently is that your manager has as much impact in your mental health as your partner.
Wow.
So having, as a leader, like just having that in mind of like, okay, like, yeah, I need to have that good relationship with my team, right? And so being a good strong leader doesn't mean being tough, doesn't mean being like invincible. Like, it means that you're human, and also being comfortable with being uncomfortable and say like, I don't know, or like, I don't know, like, we will figure this out together, right? I think that's that, to me, it tells me more like, okay, this person, like, yeah, if you are comfortable with being vulnerable, then yes, it tells me that you are strong, right? It's not when you pretend that nothing fazes you and then you are okay all the time, then I don't trust you, because that's just not human.
Right.
Just to add to that, I think when I think of mental strength, a lot of the times we think of like right stoicism, like just keeping it very together and everything. But I think it's definitely about breaking barriers, about being maybe the first one to do it in, maybe not in your family, right? The first one to kind of go to therapy, or the first person in the workplace to, you know, advocate for yourself to a higher up, right? And take that actionable step. It is about kind of stepping into the discomfort a little bit, but knowing that you're doing it because this is going to help you, because you know you're protecting your heart, your soul, your spirit, your value. You know, I just saw a question pop up about toxic workplaces, and then Nayeli with the gem about, you know, your partner can mess you up as bad as a really bad manager. It's like, yeah, like you spend so much time in this space, and so um yeah, sometimes strength is really saying, I need help. You know, I need a break. I need to, you know, slow down, and realizing that that's okay too.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to contrast this with something very, well, morbid. Nayeli's kind of shared earlier. If you were to pass away, like, would you reflect on your life and think that you had a life well lived? You know, what did you prioritize? What did you sacrifice? And was it worth it? I think, you know, I often hear this when I overwork myself, is like, you know, you're easily replaceable. Esmeralda, like the work will be there tomorrow. What won't be there tomorrow or is me, right? Yo me acabo. El trabajo no. There, work will always be there, but I won't always be here, right? And so I think when you go into a job, like Sandra was saying, like, does it align with my values? Does it align with what I want to do in this life? If your manager is going to be, you know, your other half, do they support you in the ways you're professionally want to be supported, need to be supported? You know, I'm looking at that question about rebuilding the confidence in a when there was a past toxic work.
I could read it out because only we could see them.
Okay. So I'll let you ask for it.
Yeah.
Ask it.
So there is a question, just for those who might not see it, but about if you've worked in a previously toxic work environment and then you transition to a new role, how can you rebuild that confidence that was diminished by that prior experience? Or just even if you're in a toxic environment, how do you build that confidence up?
I'll just finish.
So yeah. I just want to make sure everybody. So
I agree. No, I think there is a reflection there about what made that place toxic, and what you envision it, a new place being. Like, how supportive do you want to be? What do you want to see in place in this new job that you have, right? But I do think it is a learning opportunity in what you need and who you are and where you want to go, and where you want to spend your time, with what kind of people, what kind of boss. And so I think that starts to build confidence from the inside, you know. And I think that relying on a outside source or an institution or a workplace to know what that is for you, I think that's not a good place to not a good thing to do. You cannot rely on an external source to know exactly what you need. And so
Yeah, I was gonna say, Esmeralda, I think you kind of touched on this, right? It's also for each person, right? Their expectations and how they react to situations is going to be different, right? Like I might be in an environment and I might be like, oh my gosh, this is the most toxic environment. And maybe that's just because of how I identify, right? Whereas somebody else might be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. This place isn't that bad, you know. They give you EAP, you know. So,
exactly. And so like communicating what you need and like, those things, right? Like exactly. For one person, it might be, I'm fine. The other person's like, this is the worst place I've ever been at. So, and that goes for, for partners and friendships and all these things, but it's generalizable.
Yeah, I want to touch on this because I personally have been in a situation like that. And
you had
so,
also alluded to that earlier. So.
yes, where like, you know, what was really helpful, and if you don't have this, then it, I just talked to like other people at work, and I was like, hey, like, I just want like a objective perspective. Like, when this happened, like, was I out of bounds, or like, am I making this up, or like, was this actually like crossing like a boundary, right? So that was helpful. If you don't have a friend at work, which is like another thing that like workplaces can do, like facilitate these connections, because there are numbers that say that people that have friends at work are just happier and more productive, and they also tend to stay in the companies longer, because you have that camaraderie. If you don't have that, then I would recommend either working with a coach or with a therapist, because then you have that objective perspective in that safe space to talk about it. Because sometimes you don't feel safe in the workplace to talk about it. And I understand that, right? But that's why we have these professionals where you can say, hey, this and this happened. And I don't know if I'm making this up, or if it's triggering, because then when you move to another place and you're like, this is kind of triggering some like memories, right? And being able to make this conscious, like, is really helpful, right? It helps you with your confidence, with your self-confidence, and say like, okay, no, like that situation was just like all around like toxic, like it was not
Yeah.
me, it was the situation itself. And then just kind of like talk about this and being able to understand like, okay, no, that was me. Like, okay, well, that was not me, and that's how you build back your confidence and say, okay, like I need to work on this and I need to work on this. So yeah, I would recommend that. And if you are in the same company also it's impacting your mental health, that is also like a part where you can say like reassess your values and
Right.
say like, okay, what do I value most? My mental health and like my inner peace, or like my mental peace, or this opportunity that I have right now. And there are times where like you're going to be very focused in your career and is going to take some additional work. And there are times where you're going to be like, no, I really need to focus on me, or I really need to focus on my family. So when people talk about like work-life balance, that's really what it is. Sometimes you're going to focus on this area, sometimes you're going to focus on this area, and that's how you get, your work-life balance.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of came up as we were talking about this is finding that person or somebody that you could speak with, right? A friend at work or somebody. And how do you kind of encourage these open conversations about mental health, but without crossing certain professional boundaries, right? Like you don't to not make somebody feel uncomfortable or feel like, oh, they just said this to me. Do I need to report this or what do I need to do? What are some ways to encourage those conversations, but you keep it professional? It's a fine line.
It is. I'm thinking about it in my student perspective, and again throughout my own personal growth of like, no, I'm not gonna email my professor about an extension. I'm just gonna pull up this all-nighter because that's what I need to do. And then kind of realizing that like, it's okay to just keep it vague, like like kind of again self-reflection. What are you comfortable with sharing, or what are you comfortable with asking, right, as a leader? So something that like, let's say someone's having like their performance is kind of decreased, and you notice like they're like not attending work often, being late, all those things. So I'd probably approach it with like again with kindness, with compassion, with respect, like, hey, I noticed that lately you've been late a lot, and this is not a reprimand. I just want to know, like, how are you doing? Like, how's everything at home? Like, is there any way we can support you here? Because we want to make sure that, you're doing okay here as well. So, that way it's an open-ended question, and that person can feel as comfortable to share
Yeah.
little or as much as they want.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of like there's another question that came through, and I would just encourage folks, if you do have any other questions, to please put them in the chat. We'll keep the dialogue going here. But another question sort of related to that is, how can the company help create that culture of psychological safety where people do feel comfortable speaking up?
Yeah, I want to start on this one. Really, you're going to see the level of psychological safety in a company and how they deal with mistakes. And that's something that you can even ask in an interview. When you're applying for a job, you can ask those questions to your, the potential manager, like, how do you deal with mistakes? Or how do we deal with mistakes in this company? Like, give me an example. And that's going to tell you, how is the culture. So yeah, just when someone make a mistake, say like, things happen. Let's not focus on like pointing fingers, but like, let's focus on the solution and what can we learn from this, right? And that's how people are going to be more comfortable speaking up. And as a leader, you want to promote that, right? Because I don't know if you remember the Challenger situation where like people didn't talk about, like, just it was an O-ring that make the whole thing just like blow up because they didn't feel comfortable like talking about it. And you don't want that. You want to make
Right.
sure that your team is going to tell you about your blind spots. They're going to tell you if they made a mistake so it doesn't get bigger. Right? So
Right.
having those conversations, like, it's okay, like, it happened, let's work on it, let's find a solution. That's how you can create that psychological safety.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one more thing that also came up as well, especially as us being a room full of leaders and then leaders and watching this webinar, is that we also have to respectfully call out our other coworkers that are also creating a space that is not psychologically safe. And so some like things I'm getting, like um joking banter that can be inappropriate, that can maybe cause someone to feel uncomfortable, or someone that, is a little bit more on the more like straightforward side, but maybe they don't see that they're coming off as rude. And so I think also using our power and privileges as a way of like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you're kind of coming off in this way, and it might be impacting our employees and things like that.
Yeah, just gonna piggyback on what both of you have shared today, and that, there's a fine line, like Lucy said, like when you share about mental health, and you want to feel comfortable enough sharing like what feels safe to you as well. Sometimes just blurting everything out can, like, next day or maybe a few minutes later, you can feel like, oh, I said too much. And you can't take that back, right? And so also, like, finding some sort of like if HR, if there's some accommodations, or just, you know, at work, there's a lot of pressure on time management, the times that you come in, the times reports are due. And so having just an honest conversation about how much time does it realistically take you to turn something in, or the time that you need to be productive and turning to work. The other thing I want to mention, and it goes in accordance with Dr. Villacorta was saying, is that, you know, sometimes mental health, it could be, you know, something maybe you already have symptoms of depression or anxiety or things like that. But sometimes there's things like in the political environment that is happening that is impacting our psychology. And it does comments, gossip, you know, little remarks here and there does eat away at our mental health. And so having an inclusive environment where people are welcomed and people like are humans, like Sandra said, are humans before they are employees, I think can really go a long way in promoting inclusivity in the workplace and
I
psychological
think
safety.
yeah, I mean, Esmeralda, that's such a valid point, because I think that there are many things that people see when you're at work, right? And then there are assumptions you might make about people based on how they look, right? But you might not know the full picture, right? Like you don't know who may be living in their house with them, what their situation is, what, you know, anything, right? And there could be so many different factors that are happening, and it could be weighing on somebody, right? You're dealing for you know, just all sorts of things. And you know, it's interesting. I know one of the things, and I think somebody I mentioned this like during the interview when you asked the questions. I know that I always like to make sure I fully understand as manager what benefits my company offers. And you know, so this way, like I always feel like if I think Sandra, you had mentioned this, or somebody mentioned this, is like if you notice somebody maybe is late often, or there's something that's off, like I'll sometimes be like, hey, if you haven't talked to the benefits manager, you might want to talk to them. They've got some great things there that maybe can help you, you know, just to you know, look at the benefits a little bit more. It's a fine line, right? Because you want to keep it professional, but you also are human, and you care about people, and you know, and you want to create that psychological safety to be able to have those conversations. um Another question that came through is, what are some indicators that you use to assess whether your workplace culture is healthy? Sandra, did you want to kick that one off? The box of fidgets, no.
Lots of fidgets. Honestly, you got to put your researcher hat on. I go on Glassdoor. I do my research on the company online. That's one. And two, like Nayeli said, you know, you have to craft these questions that talk about how do you handle mistakes? You know, how do you work with employees that may come across an unexpected loss or a change in their life? What are the bereavement policies? What are your policies on childcare? If you have children, are there benefits or things in place in the workplace that will also help you? And so, going back to that first question, tying that in about the toxic work environment, taking that experience and being like Dr. Zamudio said, why was it toxic? What am I looking for that I don't want to repeat again? And then crafting questions around that as well. You know, what is your supervision style like? Are you consistent? I'm someone that is possibly neurodivergent, and so I need someone that provides structure, you know, and if that's someone that's a little bit more free reign, that's great and all, but that may not work for me, and that might impact my mental health because I'm just all over the place. And so really knowing what you need in your job, employment to really thrive and succeed and have that balance, right? Because our identities should also not just be tied to our work.
Yeah. So I know that we're getting near the end, and this has been just such a great conversation. I'm already thinking of things that I want to do and bring back to my organization. But maybe just in the last couple of minutes, if there's any sort of one or two takeaways or last items that you might want to each share before we start to close this out. Maybe we can start with Nayali and then kind of work our way.
Yeah, so since, this webinar is for like mental health awareness, I do want to encourage people to seek help. Like, I personally have been in therapy for a long time, and it's just like an investment in my health, and it makes a huge difference. And if you think that seeking help is being weak, is completely the opposite. Going to therapy is the most brave thing that you can do, because what you're doing is like going to the darkest places of your soul and personality and trying to understand why those things hurt and heal from that and shine light into it. So
Love it.
if you feel like I kind of want to do it, but I don't know, like, don't think about that. And then also, like, people don't need to know. If you don't feel comfortable sharing that you are going to therapy, people don't need to know that you're going. Now there are so many ways to do it. You can do it online. You can do it through like messages. Like, there are so many tools right now that it makes it really easy to like seek help, and also it's more affordable. So I would say look at the benefits that your company offer, first of all, because a lot of companies do offer at least some like first sessions, and then go from there.
Love it. Great advice. Esmeralda?
Yeah. Oh, that was beautiful, Nayeli. Thank you for sharing that. I do think that when you go through the journey of, I've had therapy before, I am a mental health professional. When you go through that journey, you often end up building more compassion and empathy for others. And I think that's the direction that we want to go in, being more compassionate and more empathetic with each other, because we're all like interconnected in some cosmic way, right? And we all need each other, and we all like can support each other. And competition doesn't have to be a thing. We don't have to step on somebody just so that we can look better. I think we do have to live with ourselves at the end of the day. And I think the more that we can love ourselves, I think we could make a difference with people around us. So, yeah.
Man, this is wonderful. Sandra?
Yes, I think one thing that we didn't touch too much on, but I think it's very much still connected, is imposter syndrome and knowing your strength, knowing your knowledge. We talked a lot about like questioning and toxic relationships and low self-esteem, but I think a bigger part of mental health is also reminding yourself, like, there's a reason why you're in the room, you know? And I think sometimes we do question it of like, oh, do I even belong here? Like, I'm getting all this pushback, or I'm not doing so great. But there's a reason why you're there, and you're creating representation. Not only that, but I think you're creating like this new way of showing up in a workplace, a place that actually values authenticity and our values and our culture, rather than just, again, seeing us as a number. And so, yeah, part of building that mental strength, that mental toughness, is also being like, you know what, like, I'm proud of myself. I am strong, I'm smart, I'm intelligent. There's a lot of mediocre people that will apply for a job with like 2 qualifications, and
Yeah.
you're over here questioning when you have like all 20.
Yep.
So that's something I would add as well.
Man, we just need another session. I think we could just keep this going. This has been wonderful. So, I do want to say, as we conclude this webinar on promoting mental health in the workplace, we want to extend a heartfelt thanks to each of you for joining us. Your presence and active participation truly enriched the conversation and contributed to the success of these sessions. I want to give a special thank you to Prospanica National for their ongoing commitment to empowering Latinas in the workplace and for helping to make meaningful events like this possible. This was great. I really, really enjoyed this. I'm so glad we were able to pull together for Mental Health Awareness Month. And I am excited to share details about our next webinar, which is going to be taking place on Wednesday, June 25th. And that will be focusing on the power of investing in women CEOs. So we hope that you'll join us for another inspiring and impactful discussion. So I thank you once again for spending your time with us today. I thank you to all these amazing panelists and for all your knowledge that you've shared. And we look forward to welcoming you at future events. So thank you very much for your time tonight. Good night.